Clara, 10 years, and this is how you repay my family?
If I tell you, I'll break my promise.
$300,000. You were the only one who had access. Sir, please, let her explain. Pack your things. You're fired.
I kept my promise.
What promise?
The promise I made to Helen.
My wife?
3 days earlier, no one inside Brooks Manor could have imagined that a single missing sum of money would destroy 10 years of trust. For Daniel Brooks, trust was everything. He had spent decades building one of America's largest real estate companies. Every contract, every investment, every dollar was accounted for. He expected the same honesty inside his home, especially from the people he considered family. And for 10 years, no one had earned that trust more than Clara Evans. She arrived at Brooks Manor when she was just 18 years old. Quiet, hardworking, always the first person awake, and always the last to leave. Helen Brooks often said, "This house runs because Clara has a heart that never asks for recognition." Daniel heard those words many times. But after Helen passed away, he stopped listening to anything that reminded him of her. Every morning, before anyone else stepped into the kitchen, she quietly prepared a fresh pot of coffee. Not because anyone asked her to, because Helen loved waking up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting through the mansion. Even after Helen's passing, Clara never stopped making it. It became her silent way of keeping a promise no one else knew about. Most people believed Clara was simply doing her job. They never noticed the little things. Every Friday morning, without fail, she carried a bouquet of fresh white lilies through the quiet hallway and placed them beneath Helen's portrait. No one instructed her to do it. No one thanked her for doing it. She simply never forgot. There was one place inside Brooks Manor that Daniel never entered anymore. Margaret's garden, tucked behind the eastern wing of the mansion. It had once been her favorite place in the world. She spent countless afternoons there, reading books, watering roses, and dreaming about growing old with the man she loved. But after cancer took her life, Daniel locked the iron gate. The flowers slowly stopped blooming. The fountain fell silent. Nature itself seemed to mourn her absence. Everyone believed the garden had been abandoned. Everyone, except Clara. Every Friday, before sunrise, while the rest of the mansion still slept, Clara quietly unlocked the garden gate. No one ever saw her. No one ever asked where she disappeared to for those few peaceful minutes. She never spoke about it. She simply carried fresh white lilies, walked to the old marble bench, and whispered the same words she had whispered every week for the last 2 years. She gently placed the flowers beside the bench, closed her eyes, and smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because she had kept another promise, one that mattered more to her than money, more than her job, and more than her own future. What Clara never realized was that someone had finally noticed. From the second-floor bedroom window, Daniel stood silently, watching the garden below. For the first time in 2 years, he saw fresh flowers resting beside the bench Margaret had loved. His eyebrows slowly tightened. A question crossed his mind, one he had never thought to ask before. Who has been taking care of Margaret's garden? Daniel watched until Clara disappeared behind the tall oak trees. He frowned. Something didn't make sense. For 2 years, he had believed the garden had been abandoned. Yet every flower looked freshly watered. Every pathway was spotless. Even Margaret's favorite white roses were blooming again. He had walked past that window hundreds of times. How had he never noticed? Later that morning, Daniel walked into his home office. He stopped in front of a large framed photograph. Margaret smiled back at him. It was the same smile that had once filled every room in the mansion with warmth. He hadn't smiled back in a very long time. A gentle knock broke the silence. George stepped inside carrying Daniel's morning coffee. He placed the cup on the desk, then hesitated. It wasn't like him to hesitate. Daniel noticed immediately. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For the first time that morning, his anger gave way to curiosity. George had worked for the Brooks family for over 3 decades. He rarely questioned Daniel's decisions. But today,
It's about
something was
Clara, sir.
different. Something George wanted to say, yet seemed afraid to. Daniel frowned. He had known Clara for 10 years. Or at least, he believed he had. She was always polite, always punctual, always invisible. She never asked for a raise, never complained, never called in sick. She simply worked, day after day, without expecting anything in return. Yet somehow, Daniel realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who had spent a decade inside his home. Daniel, crossing his arms, his voice calm but skeptical. Asterisk, then tell me who she really is. Asterisk. George, meeting Daniel's eyes for the first time. I don't think it's my place, sir. George lowered his eyes. He had made a promise. Not to Daniel, but to someone else. A promise he had kept. For 2 long years. And if he broke it now, everything Helen had planned would fall apart. Daniel slowly stood up. He walked toward the large window overlooking the estate. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence reminded him of the days after Helen's funeral. A silence that never truly left the house. Without turning around, Daniel finally spoke.
Did Helen know something that I didn't? Yes, sir.
Daniel slowly closed his eyes. That single answer felt heavier than the missing money. For 2 years, he believed he had known everything about his wife. Every decision, every investment, every dream. Now, for the first time, he wondered how many secrets Helen had taken with her.
What promise did she make Clara keep? I don't know the whole promise, only that Mrs. Brooks trusted her.
Daniel's eyes drifted toward the framed photograph on his desk once more. Helen's smile seemed almost unchanged. Warm, gentle, peaceful. He suddenly remembered something she had said years ago. Something he had dismissed without giving it much thought. At the time, it had sounded ordinary. Now, those words echoed in his mind louder than ever. The memory came back without warning. It was a warm spring afternoon, almost 3 years before Helen passed away. The garden was alive with blooming roses. Daniel had just returned from a business trip. As he stepped outside, he found Helen and Clara sitting together beneath the old white gazebo. They were laughing, not like an employer and an employee, but like 2 lifelong friends. At the time, Daniel barely gave it a second thought. Now, that memory refused to leave him.
Promise me something.
Anything, ma'am.
Helen looked toward the mansion, where Daniel's office window overlooked the garden. A gentle smile crossed her face. She loved her husband more than anything, but she also knew him better than anyone else. She knew how deeply grief could change a person, and she feared that one day he would need someone to remind him of the man he used to be.
If something ever happens to me, don't tell Daniel everything.
Why?
Clara searched Helen's face, waiting for an answer. For the first time, Helen looked afraid, not of dying, but of what grief might do to the man she loved. She reached into the pocket of her light cardigan and slowly removed a small, ivory-colored envelope. It had Daniel's name written neatly across the front, but instead of handing it to him, she placed it gently into Clara's hands.
Promise me, he won't see this until the time is right.
I promise.
Clara never asked what was inside. She never tried to open it. She simply tucked it safely into her handbag and carried the weight of that promise. Every single day afterward, even after Helen was gone, the envelope remained exactly where Helen had entrusted it, hidden, waiting.
What if he asks me about it?
Then tell him you made a promise.
Back in the present, Daniel stood motionless inside his office. Without realizing it, he had just heard the very same words Clara spoke before leaving the mansion. I kept my promise. At the time, he thought they were nothing more than an excuse. Now, they felt like the beginning of a truth he had never bothered to uncover. Daniel couldn't focus for the rest of the morning. The financial report remained untouched on his desk. His unanswered questions weighed far more heavily than the missing money. Just as he reached for his phone, his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Brooks, Mr. Michael Turner is here. Daniel frowned. The family lawyer rarely visited without notice. Assistant, voice through the intercom. Mr. Turner is here to see you, sir. Daniel, looking surprised. Send him in. A few moments later, the office door slowly opened. Michael Turner walked inside carrying a thick black leather briefcase. He had served as the Brooks family's attorney for nearly 30 years. He had written contracts worth billions, handled mergers that changed industries. But today, his expression carried none of his usual confidence. Michael, placing the briefcase gently on the desk. I'm sorry to arrive unannounced. But this couldn't wait. Daniel, studying his face carefully. What happened? Michael slowly unlocked the briefcase. Instead of legal documents, he carefully removed a large sealed envelope. The paper had turned slightly yellow with age. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 6 simple words. To be opened only after. Michael stopped. He looked directly at Daniel. For the first time in 30 years, the veteran lawyer seemed unsure of what to say next. Michael carefully held the aged envelope in both hands. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The office suddenly felt smaller, quieter, heavier. Finally, Michael broke the silence.
Your wife left very specific instructions. What instructions?
Michael gently placed the envelope on the desk. He didn't push it toward Daniel. He didn't open it. Instead, he rested one hand on top of it, almost as if protecting it.
Mrs. Brooks instructed me never to give you this, unless Clara was no longer working in this house.
Daniel couldn't believe what he had just heard. His wife had planned for this moment. Years ago, long before she became too weak to leave her bed, long before anyone suspected that Clara would one day walk out of the mansion. This wasn't coincidence. Helen had expected it. Every detail had already been written. Daniel stared at the envelope. His heartbeat slowed, then quickened again. For years, he believed he had known every decision Helen ever made, every investment, every charitable donation, every signature. Yet somehow, his own wife had written something that even he was never allowed to read.
Why would Helen hide this from me? Because she knew one day you would need it.
Michael reached into his briefcase once more. This time, he removed another document. Not a letter, not a contract, a sealed copy of Helen Brooks' final will. Daniel immediately recognized her signature. His hands began to tremble. Michael, placing the legal document beside the envelope. There's something else, not generated. Mrs. Brooks instructed me to show you. Daniel slowly looks down. His breathing becomes heavier. Michael slowly opened the final page of the will. He adjusted his glasses. His eyes paused on one particular paragraph. The room fell silent. Outside, the wind gently rustled the trees. Inside, Daniel's entire world was about to change. Michael lowered the document. His eyes met Daniel's. Neither man spoke. The silence felt heavier than any courtroom verdict. Then, Michael slowly turned to the final page. Michael, reading directly from Helen's letter. If Clara ever leaves this house because of you, then you have already made the greatest mistake of your life. Daniel's face goes completely pale. Daniel couldn't breathe. Those words weren't a warning. They were a prediction. Helen had known, years before, that one day, he would turn against the one person she trusted most. And somehow, she had been right. Daniel, voice trembling. Why would Helen write that? Michael, looking at him with quiet sympathy. Because she knew something you never did. The words echoed through Daniel's mind. You have already made the greatest mistake of your life. He stared at the letter. His hands slowly dropped to his sides. Every memory of Clara, every quiet, "Good morning, sir," every meal she prepared, every flower she placed in the garden, came rushing back. For the first time, Daniel wasn't wondering where the money had gone. He was wondering who Clara really was. Daniel, his voice shaking, barely able to speak. Michael, what aren't you telling me? Michael takes a deep breath before answering. Everything begins with the day your wife met Clara. Michael slowly closed the will. He didn't continue reading. Instead, he walked toward the large office window. Outside, the roses in Helen's garden gently swayed in the afternoon breeze. Without turning around, he began telling a story Daniel had never heard before. Michael, looking out toward the garden. 3 years ago, Mrs. Brooks asked me to investigate someone. Daniel looks confused. Daniel, who? Michael slowly turned around. His expression had softened. Not because the truth was easy, but because it was finally time to tell it. He looked directly at Daniel, then quietly spoke the name. That would change everything. Michael, calmly, maintaining eye contact. Clara Reynolds, your maid, was never just your maid. Daniel freezes completely. 3 years earlier, long before the accusations, long before the missing money, long before Daniel ever questioned Clara's loyalty, a rainy Tuesday morning changed everything. Helen had just finished a charity board meeting downtown. Her driver slowly guided the car through the crowded city streets. Then, Helen noticed someone. Helen, looking through the window. James. Stop the car. Driver James. Ma'am? Across the street, a young woman knelt beside an elderly homeless man. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't filming for social media. She simply removed her own jacket and wrapped it around the old man's shoulders. Then she handed him the lunch she had been carrying. Without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, Helen couldn't look away. Homeless man, his hands trembling. You need this coat more than I do. Clara, smiling warmly. I'll be okay. You need it today. Helen quietly stepped out of the car. She crossed the street alone. She wasn't interested in charity anymore. She wanted to meet the young woman who gave away the only meal she had. Helen sat beside Clara. The rain continued falling. Cars rushed past, but neither woman seemed to notice anymore. For the next 15 minutes, they simply talked. No cameras, no reporters, no charity event. Just two strangers, sharing one conversation. Helen, soft smile, genuinely curious. What do you do for work? Clara, looking down briefly before answering honestly. I clean offices at night, when there are shifts available. Helen nodded. Nothing unusual so far. Then she asked another question, one she almost regretted asking. Helen, gentle voice. Do you have any family? Clara remained silent. For several seconds, Clara finally looked up. There were no tears, only acceptance, the kind that comes after carrying pain for a very long time. Clara, calmly, with a faint smile. My mother passed away when I was 16. My father left years before that. Helen's heart tightened. Yet Clara never complained. She never blamed anyone. She simply smiled, as though kindness was still worth choosing. Helen, softly. After everything you've been through, you still help strangers? Clara, warm smile. Someone once helped me. I've never forgotten. Helen sat quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't pity Clara. Instead, she smiled. Because for the first time in years, she had met someone whose kindness was greater than her circumstances. Helen, smiling gently. If money wasn't a problem, what would you become? Clara didn't answer immediately. She stared across the rainy street, almost as though she had buried that dream years ago. Clara, soft voice. I wanted to become a nurse, just like my mother. Helen's smile faded, not because the dream was impossible, but because she realized Clara had already given up on it. Helen, why didn't you go? Clara, looking down. I couldn't afford tuition or books. Helen slowly reached into her designer handbag. Not for cash, not for a business card, for something that Clara never expected. Helen removes a small cream-colored card. She gently places it into Clara's hand. Helen, calmly. Come to my office tomorrow morning. If you're as honest as you are kind, I may have a job for you. Clara stares at the card, unable to speak. Clara, voice trembling. Ma'am, are you serious? Helen, smiles gently. I never joke about opportunity. Helen stood. She closed her umbrella. Rain immediately soaked her coat. She didn't seem to care. Before walking away, she turned one last time. Helen, tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Don't be late. Clara nodded silently. That night, Clara barely slept. The business card remained in her hands. Long after the rain had stopped, she read Helen's name. Again and again, still unable to believe it. Clara, whispering to herself, what if this is my chance? The next morning, before sunrise, Clara ironed the only formal outfit she owned. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't fashionable, but it was spotless. She wanted to make a good first impression. Clara, looking into a small mirror. You can do this. Just be yourself. She takes a deep breath. Clara stepped inside the mansion with slow, uncertain footsteps. Everything around her felt unreal. The marble floors reflected the morning sunlight like polished glass. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Every painting, every staircase, every piece of furniture whispered unimaginable wealth. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had walked into the wrong house. Before Clara could admire the mansion any longer, Helen appeared at the top of the grand staircase. She wasn't dressed like the CEO of a billion-dollar company. There were no bodyguards, no assistants, just a warm smile. That immediately made Clara feel welcome. Helen walked downstairs herself. She didn't allow the house staff to greet Clara. She wanted the young woman to know that she was being welcomed as a guest, not judged as an applicant. Clara noticed something unusual. Everyone in the house smiled at Helen. Not because they feared her, because they respected her. Helen invited Clara into a quiet sitting room overlooking the mansion gardens. Fresh coffee waited on the table. So did breakfast. Clara hesitated before taking a seat. No employer had ever treated her with such kindness. It felt less like an interview, and more like someone had already decided. She belonged there. Helen leaned back comfortably on the sofa. For a few moments, she said nothing. She simply watched Clara. Not the clothes she wore, not the handbag she carried, but the way she answered every question, with honesty. That was exactly what Helen had been searching for. Finally, Helen smiled. She reached toward the polished coffee table, not for the coffee, but for a thin blue folder. She slowly slid it across the table, stopping it directly in front of Clara. Clara looked down. Across the front, large silver letters read, "Employment Agreement." Her heartbeat quickened. She hadn't answered a single interview question. Yet somehow, there was already a contract waiting. Clara slowly opened the folder. The first page listed the position: personal housekeeper, full-time, private residence, excellent salary, health benefits, paid vacation. She blinked several times. Surely, she was reading it wrong. Clara looked up, her eyes filled with disbelief. No one had ever offered her an opportunity like this. Not even close. For the first time in years, hope felt real. Clara read the contract again, then a third time. The salary alone was more money than she had earned in the previous 3 years combined. She couldn't understand why a woman as successful as Helen would trust a complete stranger with her home. Helen finally broke the silence. She explained that she had interviewed dozens of candidates over the past month. Every resume was impressive. Every recommendation looked perfect. But after watching Clara give away her only meal to someone who could never repay her, Helen realized something that couldn't be written on paper. Skills could be taught. Character couldn't. That was the person she wanted living under her roof. That morning, Clara accepted the position. She had no idea that the mansion would become her home for the next 3 years. She also had no idea that the woman sitting across from her would become her home for the next 3 years. From that day forward, Clara treated the mansion as though it were her own home. She arrived before sunrise every morning. She memorized every routine, every favorite meal, every medication, every tiny detail that made Helen's life easier. She never worked because someone was watching. She worked because that was simply who she was. Weeks became months. Months became years. The employees stopped calling Clara the new maid. Instead, they began calling her the heart of the house. Because whenever someone needed help, Clara was already there. Helen noticed everything. She watched Clara comfort frightened employees, visit sick staff after work, buy groceries for workers who couldn't afford them. Not once did Clara ask for recognition. She believed kindness was supposed to stay quiet. One evening, Helen stood alone on the second-floor balcony. She watched Clara laughing with the gardeners outside. For the first time since losing her husband, Helen smiled without pretending. She quietly whispered, "I finally found someone I can trust." 3 years passed. The mansion had never been more peaceful. Business continued to flourish. The staff worked like family, and Helen smiled more often than anyone could remember. Then, everything changed. One ordinary morning, Helen collapsed during a board meeting. Within minutes, the mansion was thrown into panic. The diagnosis came 2 days later. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't stress. It was far worse. A rare heart condition, one that had quietly progressed for years. The doctors recommended immediate treatment, but even with the best specialists, they couldn't promise how much time she had left. Helen told almost no one. Not the board, not the media, not even most of the staff. But Clara noticed. She noticed the medication, the sleepless nights, the increasing fatigue hidden behind Helen's smile. Without being asked, Clara quietly became her caregiver. Night after night, Clara remained awake long after everyone else had gone to sleep. She made sure Helen never missed her medication. She prepared healthy meals. She canceled meetings whenever Helen became too weak. She never complained, never asked for extra pay. She simply stayed. Months passed. Helen grew weaker. The once unstoppable billionaire who had built an empire from nothing now struggled to climb the staircase inside her own home. Meetings became shorter. Public appearances disappeared. Rumors spread through the business world. But inside the mansion, only Clara truly understood how serious things had become. One rainy evening, Helen called Clara into her private library. No doctors, no lawyers, no employees, just the two of them. The fireplace crackled softly as rain tapped against the tall windows. Helen stared into the flames for several long moments, before quietly saying something that Clara would never forget. Helen spoke softly. She admitted that money had brought her power, but never peace. She had spent years surrounded by people who admired her fortune, yet almost no one truly cared whether she lived or died. Then she looked directly at Clara and smiled. She said that kindness was the greatest wealth anyone could ever possess. That conversation lasted less than an hour. Neither of them knew it would be their last peaceful evening together. Within days, Helen's condition suddenly became much worse, and before sunrise one cold morning, an ambulance raced through the mansion gates. Its flashing lights illuminated the quiet estate, while every employee stood frozen in fear. The ambulance disappeared into the darkness. Clara followed close behind. For the next 4 days, she barely left Helen's hospital room. She ignored phone calls, forgot about sleep, forgot about food. Nothing mattered, except the woman who had changed her life. On the 5th morning, Helen slowly opened her eyes. She smiled when she saw Clara sleeping in the chair beside her bed. Without waking her, Helen gently reached over and held Clara's hand. It was the first peaceful moment she had felt in weeks. Later that afternoon, Helen asked everyone to leave. Only one person remained, Clara. She reached into the bedside drawer and removed a small ivory envelope. It was sealed with dark red wax. She placed it into Clara's hands, then quietly whispered, "If anything happens to me, promise you'll give this to my attorney. No one else." Clara wanted to ask questions, but she couldn't. She simply nodded and promised. Neither of them realized that this small envelope would soon change the lives of everyone connected to the Sterling family forever. For 3 more days, Helen fought with everything she had. Doctors tried new treatments. Specialists flew in from different cities. The best medical technology money could buy surrounded her. But some battles cannot be won with money. Early one quiet morning, the heart that had built a billion-dollar empire finally stopped beating. The hospital corridor fell silent. No alarms, no shouting, only tears. Clara stood outside the room, unable to move. The woman who had given her a second chance at life was gone. News of Helen Sterling's passing spread across the country within hours. Television stations interrupted their broadcasts. Financial markets reacted immediately. Business leaders called her one of the greatest entrepreneurs of her generation. But inside the mansion, none of that mattered. Every employee mourned the woman who had treated them with dignity. 3 days after the funeral, every executive received an unexpected message. The Sterling family attorney had called an emergency board meeting. No agenda, no explanation, only one instruction. Attendance was mandatory. No one realized that before the day ended, an ordinary housekeeper would walk into that boardroom and change the future of the Sterling empire forever. Silence filled the boardroom. No one moved. No one even breathed. The attorney slowly adjusted his glasses, looked around the room, and continued reading Helen Sterling's final wishes. She had left generous bonuses to every employee, donations to hospitals, scholarships for disadvantaged students, millions to charity. Then, he reached the final page. His voice became noticeably softer. As for the remaining controlling shares of Sterling Holdings, every executive leaned forward. Each one believed they already knew who would inherit the company. The attorney looked directly at Clara. "I leave my controlling interest, together with my private residence and personal assets." He paused. To Clara, the room exploded. Several executives immediately stood. One slammed both hands onto the conference table. Another accused the attorney of making a mistake. Someone demanded another copy of the will. Others insisted Helen could never have made such a decision. The attorney never raised his voice. He calmly opened the black leather briefcase and removed the original signed documents. Every signature had been witnessed. Every page had been notarized. Everything was completely legal. Clara couldn't speak. She had never wanted money. She had never expected recognition. She had only wanted to keep one promise. The small ivory envelope Helen had entrusted to her suddenly made sense. Helen had planned everything, long before anyone else realized. She had seen something in Clara that no resume, no title, and no amount of wealth could ever measure. Character. Before leaving, The attorney handed Clara one final handwritten letter. It wasn't part of the will. It wasn't for the board. It wasn't for the lawyers. It was written only for her. The first line read, "If you're reading this, then I'm finally at peace." Clara smiled through her tears. At that moment, she realized Helen's greatest inheritance had never been the fortune. It had been her faith in one ordinary woman who chose kindness when no one was watching. If this story touched your heart, remember this. People may forget your wealth. They may forget your success, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Sometimes, the greatest investment you will ever make is in another human being. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that kindness can change the world.